Chapter 1. Your mother lied to you. You're not the greatest thing since sliced bread, and that's the truth, Jasmine said as she slammed the car door and started walking down a lee drive. Good riddance, Keith thought as he watched her disappear in the rearview mirror. What does she know? Keith and Jasmine had fought like cats and dogs the past month. It was always about him quitting high school and going to the mainland to join the Pro Bull Riding Association. 2 months earlier at the rodeo in Waimea, Keith had impressed a famous rodeo judge from Kingman, Arizona, who was visiting the Big Island. He thought Keith had serious bull riding skills after watching him easily win the local competition. The judge said Keith could make some real money if he moved to the mainland and went on the PBR tour. Jasmine, on the other hand, thought that was the worst idea she'd ever heard since they were both still in high school. She had plans of going to college and becoming a veterinarian. Being with a high school dropout that would most likely become a busted-up cowboy who didn't have 2 cents to his name wasn't acceptable to her. She was the best thing that had ever happened to Keith, except he couldn't see it because the thought of being rich and famous had clouded his judgment. 2 blocks later, Keith flipped a U-turn and drove back to get Jasmine. If she wasn't 5 miles from home, I swear I'd let her walk, he thought. When he pulled alongside of her, he said, "Come on, baby, get back in the car, let's talk about this some more." She alternated glaring at him and looking straight ahead while ignoring him, as he drove beside her for 100 yards while she mad-walked toward home. You know, you could probably be a champion speed walker. For that comment, she gave him another 20 yards of stink eye before she agreed to get back in the car. Your mother thinks just because you're a local celebrity of sorts, that you're going to be in the same league as those cowboys on the mainland. Maybe you will be. But you need to graduate from school first. He nodded, smiled, and kept his mouth shut until he dropped her off at home. Keith had already made up his mind and had bought a plane ticket to Texas where he had entered a big bull riding competition. He told Jasmine he was going to the mainland to see his brother for a week, and they would talk when he got back. He did see Bob like he said he would, he just didn't mention the part where it was at the Texas rodeo. When Keith returned to the Big Island from Texas, he had already become a legend in his own mind. Even though it was only one major rodeo under his belt, he brimmed with overconfidence that he could manhandle the competition no matter where the other cowboys were from. Since he'd won the bull riding event with a lot more points than any of the other competitors at the event, he had convinced himself it was his destiny. Clearly his mom was right, he was the best she'd ever seen, he thought. The part he hadn't told Jasmine was his mother had also told him he should graduate from high school first. It was a Sunday morning, and Keith picked up Jasmine, and they stopped to grab a couple of malasadas on the way to the beach. Besides the beach, they liked sitting on the giant lava rocks at the mouth of the harbor watching the dolphins swim back and forth and the fishing boats come and go. After they sat on the rocks and ate their malasadas, they went for a walk down the beach inside the national park next to the harbor. Keith said, "Akua Purdy from Waimea, he whipped those cowboys in Wyoming at the Rodeo World Championship and became the world champ his first time out. I don't see why I can't do the same thing." Jasmine stopped walking and turned toward Keith. "Are you sure one of those bulls hasn't kicked you in the head?" she challenged. Yes, Akua Purdy was a rodeo world champion, but he was roping steers, not getting the crap kicked out of him by 2,000-pound bulls regularly. "You're never going to change your mind about this, are you?" Jasmine shook her head, "Nope." They continued to walk down the beach, and stopped to look at a couple of sea turtles that were feeding on the moss in the rocky tide pools along the shoreline. "I'm moving to Vegas. I'm going to live with my brother and his girlfriend. She's a barrel racer, and they can help me get established." After thinking about it for a moment, Jasmine's eyes welled up. "Take me home." Keith nodded. "I'm sorry you see it that way. But I know I can beat those guys, and I have to do this. I need to put Hawaii back on the map in the rodeo world, and there's nobody better for the job here than me." Keith sat at the Kona airport, waiting to board the plane to the mainland. He was excited when he thought about joining the PBR and riding the meanest bulls in the business, and sad that his relationship with Jasmine was over. She'd made it clear he had to choose between her or the rodeo, and there was zero room for negotiation. He chose to follow his dream, but at the same time couldn't shake the feeling that he might be making the biggest mistake of his life, leaving Jasmine behind. He stopped at the top of the staircase before entering the plane, turned and took one last look at the Kona airport because he knew it would be a long time before he'd be back. "I'll show her," was the thought that drowned out all others as the plane taxied toward the runway. The plane climbed out of Kona and made a sweeping right turn out over the ocean. Keith's only thought as he peered out the window at the turquoise blue ocean and the island below was, "Aloha." Jasmine's father, Mike Murphy, had a sigh of relief when he learned that Keith had moved to the mainland to become a world champion bull rider. He had to admit the kid had guts. There had been a couple of incidents where he had come home and found Keith and Jasmine all wrapped up in each other's arms. After a talk with him about the potential consequences that would be physically harmful to Keith if he found them doing anything more than holding hands, it seemed to slow the romance to some degree. Jasmine worked at her father's small oceanfront resort part-time, and the last thing he wanted was for her to get sidetracked with a cowboy and not go to college to achieve her goal of becoming a veterinarian. "Trust me, honey. Keith leaving you is for the best. I'm sorry, I know it hurts. Eventually, that will pass. I promise," her father said. Jasmine nodded and continued to do her work at the resort. Eventually, just as her father had said, the pain passed. But for years afterward the thought lingered of what might have been, had she persuaded Keith to stay on the island. Chapter 2. 10 years later. Keith Shaw was tired of the mainland, and he couldn't wait to get back to Hawaii for the off-season. He'd enjoyed Las Vegas about all he could stand. What he was really sick of was losing money. The blackjack tables had been hoovering up his money every night. The rodeo season had been hard on him both physically and financially. He had done well enough to qualify for the final in Vegas. It was his last chance to make a lot of money and get out of debt. But it just wasn't in the cards when he got disqualified for touching the bull on one ride and a handful of low scores on others. He was thankful he was only there for a week before finally getting to go home for the off-season, for some rest and recuperation. On the first attempt of catching a flight out of Vegas, he'd used his airline miles to upgrade to a seat in first class. As the plane started its takeoff roll, his mind wandered about how he'd cover his gambling losses once he got back home. The more he thought about it, the more he realized he'd have to get a job during the off-season. He felt the sensation of being pushed back into the seat as the plane accelerated down the runway, just like he had many times before. And as the nose of the plane was about to lift off the runway, the captain slammed on the brakes at over 100 miles per hour. The aircraft swayed violently side to side as the pilot wrestled with the controls to keep it in a straight line. Keith's mind snapped to the present. Confused, he thought for a moment the plane would crash and he'd probably die, and at least he wouldn't have to repay the gambling losses. After it had come to a stop, everyone on board let out a collective sigh. Keith had always been a nervous flyer, and that episode didn't do anything to bolster his confidence in the safety of air travel or the undoing of how he was going to get out of debt. While he was grateful for still being alive, he knew he still had to get a job. The emergency stop had damaged the brake system, and the plane had to be taken out of service for that alone. Plus, the reason for the warning light in the cockpit that caused the captain to abort the takeoff in the first place. All the passengers had to be rebooked onto different aircraft after having to spend an extra night in Vegas. That was when the ticketing mistake happened that canceled Keith's seat in the first-class cabin. Once again, Lady Luck had shown Keith the door that week. 24 hours later, after finally getting a flight out, he was tired, broke, and hungover. Keith crammed into the back of the plane for the 6-hour flight back to Kona. He muttered to himself he was never flying coach again, no matter what. It was the 1st of December, and the plane was on final approach into the Kona International Airport. The view from Keith's window seat afforded a spectacular view of the sandy beaches along the coastline below. They contrasted the snow-capped mountains of Mauna Kea and Mauna Loa that towered above the island. After the plane landed and taxied to the gate, he mused, as the usual crowd of knuckleheads jumped up 3 seconds after the plane rolled to a stop. The Kona airport wasn't like one on the mainland where the plane taxied to a jetway. The ground crew would have to drive a ramp truck up to the plane before the door could be opened, and that would take a few minutes at best. Or longer, depending on who didn't show up for work that day if the surf was big. Minutes later, after what seemed like a never-ending line of people that couldn't figure out how to get their luggage out of the overhead bins, it was finally his turn to grab his carry-on and head for the exit. Keith was the last to exit the plane. At the top of the ramp, he stood for a moment outside the door. He admired the majestic snow-capped Mauna Kea that towered above the Kona coast. The warm, balmy breeze on his face felt good compared to chilly Las Vegas. As he walked down the ramp to the tarmac below, the palm trees that lined the arrival area gently swayed in the breeze as if they were doing the hula. After making his way to baggage claim, Keith glanced at his phone while he waited for his duffel bag. There was a text from his brother Bob that said, "I'm on my way." Once he'd collected his bag, he put it over his shoulder and walked to the grassy knoll in front of the airport. He laid the bag down to use as a pillow while he waited for Bob. While he leaned against the bag, he watched a stream of people going by on the sidewalk as they headed to shuttle buses and taxis. He wondered about their lives. Where they were from, where they were headed. Bulls he understood. People, especially women, baffled him. It had only been a few minutes when a memory floated up from his subconscious that reminded him of why he had left the island and gone on the rodeo circuit in the first place. For a moment he wondered about Jasmine, and what could have been had they stayed together. She had to be married by now was his next thought. Letting her get away was the one big regret in his life. He sighed, dismissed any further thoughts about her, and pulled out his phone to call Bob to see how much longer it would be. As he started to dial, he noticed out of the corner of his eye his white Ford Bronco pulling over to the curb. He slipped the phone back into his pocket, stood and waved to his brother as he grabbed the duffel bag with the other hand. He walked to the rear of the truck and threw the bag through the open back window. As Keith slid into the front seat, the brothers shook hands and Bob said, "You want to drive? I hadn't started your truck in a couple of weeks, and thought the drive down here would be good for it." "No, I'm tired. I'll just sit over here and take in the view." Bob nodded and pulled away from the curb and said, "I sure miss the old days when you could just sit out here in a lawn chair and wait for whoever you were picking up. Then I might have been here early, and you wouldn't have had to wait." Bob grinned and continued, "The new bull riding world champ shouldn't have to wait." "If it were only true. It just wasn't meant to be this time, I guess," Keith said. "You've won it before, you'll win it again," Bob said as he kept his eyes on the road and drove toward the highway. Bob looked over at Keith's championship belt buckle. "Now that's a belt buckle. Did they give that to you for making it to the finals?" Keith nodded and smiled. "I can sell it if I ever need money." "I bet you had a whole herd of buckle bunnies chasing you all the way to the airport." "Yep, I had to beat 'em off with a stick." Keith chuckled. As they drove along the coast back toward Waimea, Bob quit talking as his eyes focused on the side mirror of the Bronco. "That guy is crazy," he said as a red BMW passed them like they were standing still on the 2-lane highway. The car continued to pass a long line of vehicles ahead that were all going the speed limit. "Must be fresh off the jet," Keith said. 3 miles later, as they approached the stoplight at the Waikoloa Resort, cars began to pull over on both sides of the highway. A plume of black smoke spiraled up from the red BMW that had passed them earlier. It was now in the middle of the intersection, and had crashed into the left front corner of a Toyota Tacoma, pulling a horse trailer. Bob drove past the line of cars straight to the crash site, where he saw a crowd standing around, all with their phones out taking photos but otherwise doing nothing. The BMW was embedded into the Tacoma, and if he and Keith didn't act, the unconscious woman in the Tacoma was going to be burned alive. Keith jumped out and ran to help the woman trapped in the truck, and Bob checked on the BMW driver. As smoke began to pour from the engine compartment of the Tacoma, he yelled at Bob, "We have to get her out of here before it catches fire." It was clear to Bob, the guy in the BMW was dead, and he ran to help Keith. They pulled on the door together, but it was jammed and wouldn't budge. Bob ran back to the Bronco to grab a flashlight to use to smash a window, but yelled a minute later, "It's missing." Keith pulled off his right boot and swung it with the heel, and it bounced off the window. He tried again, and still couldn't bust the window. Flames had started to swirl up out of the engine compartment, and were creeping toward the cab. There wasn't much time left before the unconscious woman would be engulfed, if he didn't get the door open in the next 10 seconds. As he looked around for something to break the window with, he realized he was wearing the answer and undid his belt and pulled it off. He wrapped the leather end around his hand twice, and swung the end with the huge belt buckle at the window as hard as he could, and it easily shattered the glass. Keith leaned inside the truck and unbuckled the woman's seatbelt and quickly pulled her out of the now burning truck. He carried her to the lawn across the road in front of the Waikoloa Resort sign and carefully laid her on the grass. By then an nurse on her way home from work had stopped to help and took over care for the woman until the ambulance got there. Other Good Samaritans, who'd pulled over with fire extinguishers, were now trying to put out the vehicle fires. Bob handed Keith his belt that he'd dropped, and as they started to walk back to the Bronco, they heard the loud whinny of a horse inside the trailer. Keith looked at Bob. "Get the Bronco, I'll go unhitch the trailer." After they had the horse trailer hooked up to the Bronco and pulled off to the side of the road away from the burning truck, they waited for the police and ambulance to arrive. Mark Gomes was the first responding officer at the crash site. After other officers arrived to help, and he had the accident scene under control, Keith went over to talk to him about the horse and trailer. Keith recognized him from high school and said, "Hey, how's it, Mark?" Gomes paused for a second, his eyes lit up when he recognized Keith, and he said, "Hey, it's been a while. My brother and I took the horse trailer from the burned-out Tacoma. We'll be happy to board the lady's horse with us until she can come and get it, if that's all right with you." "Shoots, no problem. Just give me your phone number so I can put it in my report. And see to it the victim receives it, so she can contact you after she gets out of the hospital." As Keith pulled a card out of his wallet, he said, "This is the Flying Gecko Ranch in Waimea. My brother and sister-in-law run it. I can be reached there." Gomes nodded and took the card to write down Keith's information. As he wrote, he said, "Last I heard you'd gone to the mainland and become a big rodeo star." Keith grinned. "Something like that. I heard through the coconut wireless they were making you the Grand Marshal of the Waimea Christmas Parade." Keith's face wrinkled. "News to me," as he glanced with a look of disapproval over at Bob sitting in the Bronco. After he and Gomes were finished, he got back in the truck. "What's this I hear I'm the Grand Marshal?" Bob smiled. "Yeah, I forgot to mention that. I thought I'd spring it on you in the morning after you'd had some sleep. You know I like to be low profile. Was it you who signed me up? Who turned me into the parade people? You recall I told you I didn't win the bull riding championship this year, right? It's not like I'm Akua Purdy and returning home after winning the world title for steering roping. Tell them no." Bob had always gone along with whatever Keith wanted, but this time he went against his older brother and said, "This makes up for the year that you did win the world championship and didn't come home. You'll have to tell them yourself. I'll get you the phone number to the woman in charge. Jasmine Murphy, she's on the parade committee and the contact." The same butterflies he'd felt every time he got on a bull returned to his stomach. Keith didn't say anything to Bob for the rest of the way home, as his mind raced with thoughts about what could have been once upon a time a long time ago. Chapter 3. Betty Abernathy slowly opened her eyes and looked over and saw her niece Maddie Thompson sitting in a chair in the corner of the room reading a magazine. As Betty looked around the room, it became clear to her she was in a hospital. What wasn't was how she got there. "Auntie, you're awake," Maddie said as she sat the magazine down on the small round table beside her. "What happened to me?" Betty slowly asked as she reached up to feel the bandage on her head. "You were in a terrible accident." Almost before she could finish the sentence, Betty's eyebrows narrowed as she interjected, "Where's Jackpot? Is he okay?" "Don't worry. Once I found out you were in an accident near the Hilton, I knew you never made it to the harbor, so I knew to find out what happened to Jackpot. I've made arrangements to get him back to the ranch." Betty took a deep breath, slowly let it out and said, "Let's start from the beginning. What happened to me and Jackpot? And where is he?" "A man ran a red light and crashed his car into your truck. 2 men pulled you from the wreckage just before it became fully engulfed in flames. The same 2 men took Jackpot home with them until you or Uncle could go get him." As Maddie looked up at the blood pressure monitor, she saw her auntie's numbers had risen sharply in just the few minutes that she'd been awake. "Don't worry, Auntie, Jackpot is with good people and he wasn't injured." Betty's brow was still furrowed. "Where's Uncle? Why didn't he go get Jackpot?" Maddie sighed. "I don't know where he is, but his boat's gone. I tried calling him multiple times and all I got was his voicemail. One of the nurses here called me when they brought you in." "Oh, how did she know I was your auntie?" "The paramedics found my name and number in your purse and gave it to a nurse here when they brought you in. While one man pulled you out of the burning truck, the other grabbed your purse and gave it to the paramedics when they arrived at the accident. The paramedics didn't know anything about Jackpot. It wasn't until I called the police that I found out what happened to him. They said the men who'd saved you were from the Flying Gecko Ranch and that they would take care of Jackpot until he could be retrieved. Since I couldn't find Uncle, I called the Flying Gecko Ranch and asked if they could bring Jackpot to our ranch tomorrow, and they said yes." Betty sighed. "When you see Jasmine, would you ask her to give him a thorough exam after he gets dropped off if I'm still here?" "Consider it done. When I get back to the clinic, I'll tell her he's coming home tomorrow. I just wanted to be here when you woke up. One of the nurses said they'll call me when you're ready to go home, and I'll be back to get you then." Maddie glanced at the blood pressure numbers on the monitor and saw they had started to drop now that Betty knew Jackpot was okay. She hugged her auntie and left to go back to work. After Maddie had gone, Betty picked up the phone off the table next to her bed and dialed Willard's cell. It went straight to voicemail. That was the last straw. She'd made up her mind and was going to hire a ranch hand, so she didn't have to rely on Willard anymore. The older he got, the less he liked working, and the more he liked fishing. It had gotten to the point where he'd wander off to go fishing sometimes for 2 or 3 days at a time, if he took the boat. Finding an experienced ranch hand was going to be hard. Good cowboys were few and far between on the island, and all the good ones already had jobs at Parker Ranch. It was the biggest cattle ranch in the state, and at one time the world and its Paniolo were fiercely loyal. Getting one of them to quit and come to work for a small outfit like the Abernathy Ranch would be highly unlikely if not impossible. Betty would just have to find a stray. And finding strays was what she excelled at. Betty Abernathy had become well known as the person to call if you had a critter that needed a home. It didn't matter what kind it was or where it came from, she'd take it. Her ranch had become an animal sanctuary and a tourist attraction. It was listed in all the island guidebooks. A few visitors had even commented her place looked more like a 3-ring circus than a ranch. The animals on the ranch were mostly horses and anything that had wings. From a talking myna bird to a Hawaiian hoary bat. The wild parrot section had 20 full-grown macaws that Betty had taken in when an old man down in Ocean View had died. And that was how it began years earlier. It wasn't much longer after that someone showed up with a zebra and a Texas longhorn steer. Her latest addition to the ranch, Ohana, was a pregnant mare named Kaylani. She was a sweet horse that liked everyone, and was expected to birth a foal sometime around Christmas. To have Kaylani in the best shape possible when it was time to give birth, someone had to walk her 2 or 3 times every day, and Betty needed to find that someone fast. It was only Betty and Willard who'd fed and cared for all the animals for many years until he'd suffered a heart attack. Then the majority of the work had fallen on her, and she just wasn't able to keep up by herself anymore. Partnering with Dr. Jasmine Murphy DVM to open an animal clinic on the ranch was a step in the right direction. Now she just needed one good cowboy. Chapter 4. After a good night of sleep, Keith's resolve had weakened when it came to not riding in the parade as the Grand Marshal. He was still pretty sure he wasn't going to do it. But the thought of Jasmine wanting him to do it was something he hadn't been prepared for. It was 7 a.m., and Nancy was finishing up getting the kids fed breakfast before sending them off to school. Keith entered the kitchen half asleep, wearing a t-shirt and jeans, turned around and went back to his room to put on a flannel shirt because he was cold. "Dang, it's cold this morning." "It's colder here than it was in Vegas," Keith said after he returned to the kitchen. Nancy nodded and looked at the thermometer on the kitchen window. 43 degrees, that's almost the record, just in your honor. "It's been like this since the first snow on top of Mauna Kea," she said as she handed him a cup of coffee. Keith grabbed the cup and sat at the table next to his two nieces. The table was an old ranch style in the corner of the kitchen. He reached an arm around Emily and Samantha and gave them a light hug and said, "I missed you young ladies." Samantha was 8, and Emily 10. They had already eaten breakfast and were finishing up their hot chocolate before getting ready to catch the school bus. They smiled as they held their cups close to their lips while their little eyes focused on Uncle Keith. He was a larger-than-life cowboy, as far as they were concerned. Not only was he a cowboy, but the uncle who always brought them something every year when he returned from the rodeo season. This year he brought each of them a bracelet made from a horseshoe nail, formed into the shape of a heart. He'd picked them up at the Christmas Cowboy Festival in Vegas just before he got on the plane. There was no doubt in the family that the young sisters would someday grow up to become world-class barrel racers. Nancy had won more than her fair share of races all over the western United States before she and Bob moved back to Waimea to settle down and raise a family. "Where's Bob?" Keith asked after he took a sip of coffee. "He's down feeding the horses." Nancy grinned. "He told me you're going to be the Grand Marshal of this year's Christmas parade." "Bah humbug," Keith said as he read the headline in the local paper that said the same thing. "I see you still love Christmas." Keith nodded and smiled. "I'm going down to the bookstore in Kona today and get my picture taken with the Grinch." He folded the front page of the newspaper over, so he didn't have to see the headline, laid it on the table and took another sip of coffee. "I have to say, they just don't have coffee like this on the mainland. This is so good, I almost don't want to ever leave the island again." "Almost, but come February I'm off to San Angelo for the first big event of the season. We were hoping this would be the year you retired and stayed home. Grandpa could really use your help around the farm. Bob and I try to help him when we can, but it's not enough. He really needs someone full-time. He's never been the same since Grandma passed." Keith shook his head. "I wish I could, but I'm not quitting until I win the world championship or die trying. Besides, he should sell that place and take the money and go on a world cruise." Nancy's eyebrows narrowed as she mouthed, "Not in front of the kids," and stared at Keith while she scooted Samantha and Emily out the door to catch the school bus. To escape Nancy's wicked glare, Keith glanced down at the back page of the newspaper lying on the table. Those butterflies he had the day before shot right back into his gut. He picked up the paper and stared at the reason for them. It was a photo of a beautiful woman he recognized. The article below it was about the new animal hospital located at the Abernathy Ranch. It went on to say Dr. Jasmine Murphy was a recent graduate of the prestigious veterinary school at Texas A&M, and that she looked forward to serving the community. Keith laid the paper down and sighed, then picked it back up and reread the article to make sure he hadn't missed the one thing he hoped wasn't in it, and he hadn't. Nowhere in the story did it mention a husband. As he pondered the article, the screen door on the back porch slammed shut, and jolted his attention toward Bob as he came into the kitchen. Keith could tell his brother was still annoyed with him by the tone of his voice, as he said he had Jasmine's phone number, and threw it down on the table. Bob didn't even look at Keith as he walked past him headed to the coffee pot to pour himself a cup. He stood with his back to Keith as he stirred in a mixture of cream and sugar. "I'll do it," Keith said as he got up to refill his cup. Bob smiled, still looking down at his cup while he continued to stir. "I knew you would. You're stubborn as a mule. But you always do the right thing." Chapter 5. Lonnie sat at the door and patiently waited for Jasmine to let her out so she could take care of her early morning business. She was an Australian shepherd of the blue merle variety that Jasmine had decided was going to be her significant other, and a replacement for a man anytime soon. Jasmine didn't have the time or the desire for a boyfriend. Once, just before going to the mainland for veterinary school, she'd thought she'd found love, but it turned out it wasn't meant to be. Her life now focused around the animal clinic at the Abernathy Ranch, and the only thing she had time for was taking care of the animals there. While Lonnie roamed around the yard looking for the perfect spot, Jasmine admired the fresh blanket of snow that covered the top half of Mauna Kea like a quilt. She'd grown up in Kona where it was warm year-round, and Waimea sat at 2,600 feet above sea level and got downright cold in the winter compared to Kona and most other areas of the island. "With the snow on Mauna Kea, it feels like Christmas," she said as she came back inside with the morning newspaper. Maddie had just finished her coffee and was standing in front of the kitchen sink rinsing her cup and replied, "I know. I checked the thermometer when I got up, and it said it was 41 degrees, and that was a half hour ago." Jasmine stared at the front page of the paper as she walked toward the kitchen to get some coffee while she listened to Maddie. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Maddie said as she watched Jasmine gawk at the newspaper headline with her mouth wide open, then lay the paper down on the kitchen table. "Sort of. The Grand Marshal for the Christmas parade is Keith Shaw." "Can I buy a vowel?" "I have no idea what you're talking about," Maddie said. "I'm on the parade committee, and we all agreed that Connor Valenzuela was going to be the Grand Marshal. Not Keith, a legend in his own mind, Shaw." As Maddie put her coat on to leave, she said, "Well, I can see this is going to be a long conversation that is going to include a gallon of ice cream. Since I don't eat ice cream for breakfast yet, maybe you can tell me all about him tonight after we go get a Christmas tree. But right now, I have to go pick up Betty from the hospital. They called and said she's ready to check out." Maddie stopped at the front door and said, "Oh, one more thing, we're not having a fake Christmas tree. I'm going to buy a real tree tonight after work, with or without you. How about we go down to the Parker Ranch tree lot tonight, after we've closed the clinic?" Jasmine nodded. She liked the idea of saving money on a fake tree. But she couldn't argue with Maddie about the fact that a real tree would make their apartment smell like Christmas, and a fake tree wouldn't. No matter what they sprayed on it, trying to get it to smell like the real thing, it just wasn't the same. After Maddie left, Jasmine called Annabelle Rubio, who was the secretary of the parade board, to find out what happened. "Why is Keith Shaw's name on the front page of the newspaper and not Connor Valenzuela?" she asked. "Connor canceled last night just before the paper was going to print the announcement, and since Keith was the second choice, I called the paper at the last minute to put in Keith's name. I tried to get a hold of you last night to let you know, but your phone went straight to voicemail. I left a message." Jasmine paused. She hadn't checked her messages and was annoyed with herself because the first thing she had done was call Annabelle. "I'm sorry, Annabelle, you did the right thing. I apologize if I sounded upset." "No worries, I gotta go, sista, my phone's blowing up this morning, aloha." Jasmine thought about it for a few minutes while she drank another cup of coffee. It really wasn't anything to get all worked up about. It wasn't like she would have to see him today. It wouldn't be until the parade, and it would only be a fleeting moment as he passed by, perched on the back of a convertible. And it was unlikely he'd see her in the crowd. Chapter 6. As Maddie drove Betty home from the hospital, she said, "Keith Shaw called yesterday and apologized he hadn't been able to bring Jackpot home because the horse trailer got a flat tire just as he was pulling out of his driveway. He said the tire shop couldn't fix it and told him he needed to get a new one, but they were out of that size. He had to go to Kona to get the right one last night and swore he'd have Jackpot here by 10 a.m. today." Betty sighed. "Okay, but if he's not at the ranch by then, we'll take our trailer and go get him." "Oops, never mind." Betty shook her head. "He has our trailer. I guess my mind is still foggy from that conk on the head I got when that maniac crashed into me in Jackpot." Later that morning, just as Keith had promised, He pulled into the parking lot of the Abernathy Ranch and Animal Clinic at the time he said he'd be there. Maddie and Jasmine were in the clinic office. Maddie was doing the paperwork, and Jasmine was giving Mrs. Sweeney instructions on how to care for her sick cat. Neither of them noticed the bronco and horse trailer until after Mrs. Sweeney and her cat had left the office. Maddie was the first to spot Keith as he unloaded Jackpot from the trailer. "Jackpot's here, and remember, Betty asked if you'd check him out as soon as he arrived. And speaking of checking him out, have a look at the cowboy that brought him. That's one tall cool drink of water." Jasmine frowned. Maddie had seen that look on her face before, and could tell she wasn't happy. "You don't look happy to see him. I take it you know him?" Jasmine nodded. "Let's go get it over with," she grumbled. "You don't mind if I have a turn at him, do you? In this town we just keep recycling the limited supply of boyfriends." "You'll learn that after you've been here a while," Maddie giggled. "If he's anything like he was back in high school, you'll need a bigger car than your Honda Civic to haul his ego around in." "That was a long time ago. Maybe he's a little more down to earth now? Besides, he's been nothing but perfectly polite and humble the couple of times I've talked to him on the phone, and remember, he saved Betty's life. But don't worry, I was only joking about wanting to date him. He's got you written all over him." Jasmine glared at Maddie as they walked to the Bronco. Betty had seen the truck and horse trailer pull into the lot from her office window in the main house, and was out there to greet Keith and Jackpot before Jasmine and Maddie. Betty gave him a big hug, and thanked him for saving her and Jackpot from the fire. "It wasn't a big deal, just glad my brother and I were there in time." "Tell your brother I said thank you, and if there's anything I can ever do, just ask." Keith nodded. "Yes, ma'am." Betty started to turn back toward the house and stopped and said, "When you're finished unhooking the trailer, come up to the house, and I'll get you a check for the tire and your expenses." "Yes, ma'am," and he tipped his hat and Betty went back to the house. When he turned back to the trailer to start unhitching it, Jasmine and Maddie were standing there. It was like Maddie wasn't even there, as Keith and Jasmine gazed into each other's eyes. It was as if time had stopped for a minute, and they peered into each other's soul. There was something about that cowboy that put butterflies in her stomach, like she hadn't felt in a long time. She sensed there was something different about him. Maybe Maddie was right. It had been a long time since they were in school together, and sometimes people do change for the better, she thought. "Hi Keith, it's been a long time, this is Maddie." He smiled and handed Maddie the reins to Jackpot, and she led him to the stable as she shot Jasmine a grin over her shoulder. There was an awkward moment of silence before Jasmine said, "I have to go check him out." "Sure, it's good to see you. Maybe I'll see you around?" "I doubt it, I work here all the time. And I'm the only vet in the area, so I'm on call during the after hours." "Wow. That's great. It doesn't surprise me you became a veterinarian. That's what you said you were going to do. You were always great with animals when we were in 4-H way back when." "Thanks, I got to go," Jasmine said and headed off to the stables to examine Jackpot. After Keith got the trailer unhitched, he did as Betty asked and went to the ranch house to get a check. He stood in the office and looked around the room at all the photos of horses and blue ribbons on the wall. While she wrote the check, he said, "You wouldn't have a need for an experienced ranch hand, would you, ma'am?" Betty stopped writing and looked up from her desk. "As a matter of fact, I do." She spent 20 minutes interviewing Keith and afterward said, "You're hired. I'll see you here in the morning if you want the job." "I'll be here." It was only a short-term job. Keith explained that he was only there temporarily because it was the rodeo off-season, and she was fine with that because it would give her time to find someone more permanent. Chapter 7. Keith returned to the Flying Gecko Ranch and found Bob changing the oil on the tractor in the barn. Bob looked from underneath the tractor and said, "Tonight we're going to get a Christmas tree, want to come along? Did you see Jasmine when you dropped off the horse?" Keith nodded and grinned as he leaned against the rear tire of the tractor. "How did you know she had opened a clinic there, on the Abernathy Ranch?" Keith asked. "It was in the paper a couple of months ago." They had an open house, and we took the girls to see all of the animals. It's quite the menagerie. How did it go when you saw Jasmine? She pretty much scowled at me the entire time. I can't wait to see the look on her face when she finds out I got a job there. You got a job, doing what? Betty Abernathy hired me to basically walk a pregnant mare a few times a day and feed the livestock. Refresh my memory, why did you and Jasmine quit seeing each other back in high school? It was my fault. Of course it was, Bob snickered. And to tell you the truth, I've always regretted it. Back then, I'd been kind of a jerk after I won a few rodeo events and thought I was the king of the rodeo. Bob laughed and rolled his eyes, there was no kind of to it. You'll probably agree that humility wasn't my strong suit when I was younger. Heck, I didn't even know what the word meant. It wasn't until a couple of years later, after I started riding bulls on the mainland, that I got a clear understanding that I wasn't the king of the rodeo. But I plan to be again come next year, Keith said as he bent down and handed Bob a rag to wipe the oil off his hands. Bob rolled his eyes, still humble as ever I see, and then changed the subject. Did you go see Grandpa after you dropped the horse off? Yeah, I got the memo from Nancy this morning. I stopped over at his place and told him I could give him a hand around the farm while I am here, and he said thanks, but he didn't need any help, and that he had everything under control. He's just as stubborn as you are, Bob said as he screwed the drain plug back into the oil pan of the tractor. I have a plan though. I'll be stopping by there a few times a week to give him a hand, and hopefully make it look like I'm just there to visit. By the time he catches on, it should be just about time to head back to the mainland. Bob smiled as he crawled out from under the tractor and said, "You're a good man." After dinner, Keith tagged along with Bob and Nancy and the kids to buy a Christmas tree. Keith and Bob were following behind Nancy, who was being led down each row of Christmas trees by Samantha and Emily. After they looked at all the different trees, Emily and Samantha narrowed it down to a 6-foot-tall Douglas fir. The tree was in a row where all the trees were tightly grouped together, and they couldn't see the people in the next row over. On one side of the tree was the Shah Ohana, and on the other was Jasmine and Maddie, who decided at almost the same time they wanted the same tree too. That one, Uncle Keith, Emily and Samantha said in unison as they pointed. Keith grabbed the tree and swung it around to take it to the truck, and he never saw Maddie and Jasmine. That jerk stole our tree, and he's so oblivious he didn't even see us standing here, Jasmine said. Maddie sighed. I guess there isn't going to be any kind of Christmas romance between the two of you. Jasmine huffed. I can't wait for him to go back to the mainland. This town isn't big enough for the two of us. Maddie gave Jasmine the side eye. I saw how you looked at him earlier today. Your mouth and your face obviously don't agree about what your heart thinks about him, and that tree really was too big for our apartment anyway. The Shah Ohana returned home to the Flying Gecko Ranch and set up the Christmas tree in the corner of the living room. Nancy decorated it with help from Emily and Samantha while Christmas music played, and they sipped hot chocolate. Keith and Bob sat at the kitchen table and had coffee so they could stay out of the way of the flying tinsel in the living room. Did you notice Jasmine at the Christmas tree lot? Bob said. Huh? Bob grinned. I'm pretty sure you grabbed the tree she was starting to reach for. Keith shook his head. Never saw her. All I saw was the tree branches in my face all the way to the truck while you went and paid. I'm pretty sure you stole her tree, and if you had any thoughts of getting back together with her, you're toast, Bob laughed. After Keith swallowed a sip of coffee, he said, It doesn't matter, I'm going back to the mainland after the holidays anyway. Bob smiled. Go ahead, keep telling yourself that if it makes you feel better. Chapter 8. The Abernathy ranch house where Betty and Willard lived was at the end of a long driveway with lush green pastures on each side. The entire 30-acre property was railed by white fences. On the opposite side of the road was a large parking lot with the barn on one side. Across from the barn was the animal clinic in a metal storage building that had been converted to a state-of-the-art medical facility. Next to the barn was the horse stables, aviary, and an arena that could be seen from the house and the clinic. It was a few minutes before the clinic was scheduled to open, and Jasmine and Maddie were bent over the check-in desk while they looked over the scheduled appointments for the day. Keith's Bronco caught their eyes as he slowly rolled past the office and parked near the barn on the other side of the lot. They stared through the glass office door and watched him get out of the truck. Betty came out of the stable to take Keith on a tour of the property and give him instructions of what needed to be done. "What's he doing here?" Jasmine muttered, as she and Maddie continued to watch him and Betty. Before Maddie could respond, Mr. Jenkins was at the door with his cat Boots, who was their first appointment of the day. After Betty had given Keith the tour, she stopped by the clinic office just after Mr. Jenkins had left. Maddie was updating Boots' history, and Jasmine was making a cup of tea when Betty came through the door. "Just so you guys know," Betty said, "Willard can't handle the chores around the ranch anymore, and I hired Keith Shaw to take care of them. If you need anything, just let him know if I'm not around. Now I have to go see about making arrangements to ship Jackpot to Oahu, since he missed the barge because of the accident." Betty left the clinic office and went back to the ranch house. Maddie smiled at Jasmine but didn't say anything. Jasmine continued to stir her tea with vigor like a cat swishing its tail as she stared out the window toward the barn. The clinic got a barrage of sick animals that morning, and there were a couple of emergencies, and it wasn't long before it was time for lunch. Usually, Maddie was the one who went and got lunch and brought it back to the office. But today Jasmine needed to run an errand and stopped to pick up a couple of plate lunches while she was out. The clinic office was small, and there was a couple of chairs and a bench outside near the front door for people to sit and wait. When Jasmine returned from her errand, she got out of her truck carrying a bag from L&L Hawaiian barbecue for her and Maddie. Keith sat on one of the benches and was waiting for Jasmine. He took off his hat and stood as she approached the office door. "My brother told me that I may have accidentally stolen your Christmas tree. I never saw you there, and I'm sorry. I certainly wouldn't have done that on purpose." Jasmine cut her eyes toward him as she passed by. "Duly noted. And by the way, I voted for the other guy when it came to who would be the Christmas parade grand marshal." "What did he say?" Maddie asked, as Jasmine sat the bag of plate lunches on the desk. "He apologized for stealing our Christmas tree. He said he didn't see us looking at it, and that he only became aware of it because his brother saw what happened. I told him I voted for the other guy." "Man, you're hard," Maddie said as she opened her plate lunch of barbecue chicken. "What are you, his lawyer? You're always sticking up for him." "No, I just see a guy who's made mistakes that at least seems to be trying to make amends for them. Maybe you should think about letting go of that glaring resentment you have toward him, that everyone except you can see." Jasmine had more than a piece of barbecue chicken to chew on while she thought about what Maddie had said. For the next week, it was business as usual at the Abernathy Ranch. Keith was busy feeding the animals and walking Kaylani 3 times a day. The animal clinic had a steady stream of people bringing in their pets for medical attention. Jasmine and Maddie didn't have much time to watch what Keith was doing. But a few times during the week, Maddie caught Jasmine staring out the window watching him work Kaylani with a lunge line. It was obvious that Keith wasn't satisfied with just walking her around the arena, and had begun to train her. After a week of working with her, he got her to the point that he didn't need a halter and lead line on her. Jasmine and Maddie had become mesmerized watching him train her every day. Kaylani followed him wherever he went in the arena. Maddie came up next to Jasmine one late afternoon when she was watching Keith work with Kaylani. "He really knows what he's doing, don't you think?" Jasmine nodded. "I had no idea he was that good with horses." Maddie sighed. "I could watch him work with Kaylani all day." Jasmine looked at her watch. "Let's close up, it's Puahana time. I want to get to the parade early, so we get a good spot. My family's coming from Kona, so I said I'd save them seats. Wait until you meet my little nephew Henry, he's so cute." Chapter 9. Earlier in the day when Jasmine went out to pick up lunch, she'd set up a tent for her ohana to watch the Christmas parade from. Every year the parade route was always packed with people, and it was common to set up a tent even a day early. Jasmine and Maddie arrived early at the tent, and had their spot claimed and ready for the parade. A while later she heard a little voice say from behind, "Auntie Jasmine." She turned and saw her nephew Henry. Her older sister Jessica was a few feet behind him, making her way through the crowd. "Where's Sam and Pua?" "He's parking the car and Pua had something come up, and she can't make it." "That's too bad. I always like hearing about her boyfriend of the month. It makes me feel better about my love life, or lack thereof," Jasmine said. A few minutes later Sam made his way to the tent, greeted Maddie and hugged Jasmine. While everyone sat and waited for the parade to start, they talked story about what was going on in Kona and Waimea. "How's the clinic doing?" Jessica asked. "Great, we've been really busy. Word travels fast that we're open because it's such a small community. As a matter of fact, I have a payment for you guys," Jasmine said as she slipped Jessica an envelope. "Look." Henry pointed down the road at the fire truck coming their way with its lights on. It was the start of the parade. "Ah, to be 6 years old again," Maddie said as she watched Henry's excitement. Jasmine and Jessica smiled, and Sam nodded as he picked the boy up, so he could get a better view. The second vehicle in the parade was a two-tone blue and white '56 Chevy convertible that carried the Grand Marshal. Jessica's brow furrowed as she read the name Keith Shaw on the sign on the side of the car, and turned toward Jasmine. "Didn't you date him in high school? And wasn't he the one Dad ran off because he thought the two of you were getting a little too chummy? I seem to recall having to chaperone you guys once." Jasmine heaved out a sigh. "That would be him." Jessica continued, "Have you seen him since you moved here? If not, maybe you should. It looks like he did pretty well for himself if he's the Grand Marshal." Maddie giggled under her breath as she watched Jessica play 20 questions about Keith. Eventually, Jessica sensed Jasmine wasn't thrilled to talk about an old boyfriend and changed the subject. The parade continued with lots of different floats and trucks, all decked out with Christmas lights and decorations. Near the end of the parade, Sam pointed down the road again. "Henry, look at the canoe all lit up. I think Santa Claus is riding in it." Henry clapped his little hands as fast as he could, as the canoe approached. Everyone heard a booming voice coming from Santa. "Mili Kalikimaka," he shouted as he passed by. After the parade was over, everyone headed over to one of the observatories that was having an open house after party. As Jasmine peered in the front door at the crowd, she said, "There's way too many people here. How about if I give you guys a private tour of all the animals at the ranch?" Henry's eyes lit up. "Yeah, let's go see all the animals." Sam and Jessica nodded. At the ranch there were half a dozen horses inside the stable, and Jasmine said, "Hey, let's go look at Kaylani and see how she's doing. She's going to have a baby horse soon, Henry." While everyone was focused on petting Kaylani, they hadn't noticed Keith, who was at the other end of the stable feeding the horses. "What's he doing?" Henry asked. "It looks like he's feeding the horses. Would you like to go help him?" Jasmine said. Henry smiled and nodded. Keith was close enough that he heard the whole conversation between Henry and Jasmine, and as the group approached, Keith said, "Here, let's pour this bucket of grain in his bowl," and he let Henry hold the side of the bucket as they poured. It was the first time Maddie had seen Jasmine smile around Keith as she watched him with Henry. After he and Henry were done feeding Jackpot, Jasmine introduced Keith to Sam and Jessica. "It's an honor to meet you, Keith. I Googled you after I saw you in the parade earlier tonight. It's nice to meet a world-class cowboy, especially one from the Big Island," Sam said. "Pleasure's all mine, sir," Keith said as he shook hands with Sam and Jessica. "Would you mind signing this for Henry?" Sam asked, as he handed Keith the parade flyer that he had in his back pocket. After Keith and Henry had finished feeding the horses, they formed their own little group with Sam. They kicked and spit as they walked through the stable, while Keith explained all things rodeo to them. Jasmine, Jessica, and Maddie hung out over in front of Kaylani's stall, trying to guess when the foal was going to come. Sam and Jessica had to pry Henry away from the horses when it was time to go home. After they'd left, Jasmine went back inside the stable where Keith was and said, "Thank you. That was a nice thing for you to do." Keith nodded, "You're welcome," as he continued to muck out a stall. After Jasmine returned home, she sat down on the couch next to Maddie and sipped a cup of tea, as she savored the fragrance of the fresh-cut Christmas tree that filled the apartment. Maddie sat the book down that she was reading and said, "It was a great parade tonight, and Keith letting Henry help feed the horses. Oh my gosh, that was so cute." Jasmine smiled, "Yes it was. I almost want to like him again. He seems like he's grown up a lot since we were in high school. But it doesn't matter, because according to Betty, he's going back to the mainland in a couple of months to compete for the bull riding world championship." "He's a bull rider?" "Lord," Maddie said as she fanned her book in front of her face. Jasmine laughed, "Quit it. Get that out of your mind. Tomorrow I'm going to Kona to go Christmas shopping. Do you want me to pick up anything for you?" "Yes, a whip and some spurs," Maddie laughed. Chapter 10. It was 10 days before Christmas, and Kona town was full of shoppers there to buy presents. The first stop for Keith was Walmart. He was searching for a scooter that his niece Emily wanted for Christmas. Even though jingle bells were playing throughout the store, it looked like a bomb had blown up in the toy department. Pretty much everything left was strewn about. He overheard a couple of women talking about how popular the scooter was that year, and one of the ladies said Target still had them. Okay, Target it is, Keith thought, and he made his way through the crowded store to the exit as quick as he could before the last scooter in Kona was gone. After he pulled into the packed parking lot at Target and circled around looking for a place to park, he started to wonder what the odds were of the store actually having any scooters left. Maybe they're not all there for the same toy, he hoped. As he walked toward the store entrance, he saw Jasmine enter the store with a throng of other shoppers. The butterflies were back. The night before in the stable with her was different. Up to that point his plan had been steadfast, and he would head to Texas in a couple of months for the start of the rodeo season. Now he felt for the first time maybe not. Just being in the stable with her and her family felt so right, and he couldn't explain it. But the one thing he always did was trust his gut, and his gut was trying to tell him something was up. Hopefully she doesn't think I'm following her. The last thing I need is any drama, he thought as he walked through the front doors. As Keith made his way into the store, he hoped the toy section wasn't destroyed like it was at Walmart. He was pleasantly surprised when he rounded the corner to the toy department, and it still looked like they had a lot of inventory. He slowly strolled the aisle looking for the scooters, but didn't see any. As a clerk walked by, he asked him, "Do you guys have any scooters left?" "You're close, one aisle over," the clerk said as he pointed which way to go. That's good, at least he didn't say they were out of them, Keith thought. As he rounded the corner into the next aisle, he stopped dead in his tracks as he saw Jasmine pick up the last scooter. She looked up and smiled, "Is this what you're looking for?" Keith cracked a grin and nodded. Jasmine smiled, "Bummer, I'm certain this is the last one in Kona since I've been to every store in town looking for one. It looks like Hilo is your next stop if you want one bad enough," she said as she turned and headed for the cash register. "I guess she's still mad about the Christmas tree," he muttered to himself. 2 hours and 100 miles later, Keith was at the mall in Hilo. He looked in every store in the mall that he thought might carry the scooter, to no avail. "Well, kid, you're out of luck," he thought, as he made his way back to the Bronco to head back to Waimea. It was getting late, and Keith decided to go home via Saddle Road, which was one step above a pig trail. It was a narrow 2-lane road built during WWLL, and going that way would shave 20 minutes off his drive back to Waimea. 35 miles from Hilo, he realized the error of his ways when he could hardly see his hand in front of his face due to the fog that had enveloped the valley between Mauna Kea and Mauna Loa. Visibility had gotten so bad that he pulled over to the side of the road to wait for it to clear and fell asleep. He woke to the sound of an approaching vehicle just before the impact. It crashed into the front left side of his Bronco and crushed the fender and door. Keith's left arm took the brunt of the impact when he instinctively stuck his hand out to protect himself. A couple of soldiers from the Pahakaloa training center nearby had left the base and were on their way to Waimea when they came upon the accident. They checked both drivers and focused their attention on Keith, since he was the only one who survived. After they put his badly broken hand and arm in a splint, they took him to the hospital in Waimea. The pain was so intense, Keith had passed out on the way, and when he woke up later in the hospital, his left arm was in a cast, and his head felt like somebody had been using it for basketball practice. His first thought was that next year's rodeo season was over before it had ever got started. His left hand was what he always held onto the rope with when he rode bulls. The door to his room opened and his brother Bob said, "You're lucky, the other guy's dead. I called Betty this morning, so she knows why you're not coming to work today." Keith started to nod and then stopped. "I'll note to self, don't move," he said as his brow furrowed and he reached up with his right hand to feel his head. "What happened?" "The cops think the other guy fell asleep, or he had a heart attack. They didn't find any alcohol in his car, and they said they didn't smell it on him. I pulled off to the side of the road earlier because it was so foggy. I couldn't see my hand in front of my face, and I fell asleep, and the next thing I know, here I am. The doctor said multiple bones in your hand and wrist are badly broken. Looks like you'll be staying home for at least a year." Keith started to nod, but caught himself when the pain in his head reminded him not to move. "I better go and let you rest," Bob said as he lightly grasped Keith's shoulder. After he opened the door, he stopped and held it open for Jasmine. She smiled at Bob as he left. "Are you here to finish the job?" Keith said with a grin. "Betty told us you were in an accident last night, on the way back from Hilo. I feel like it's my fault for saying you had to go there if you wanted a scooter that bad. If I'd have known, I would have given you the one at Target," she said as her eyes welled up. "It's okay, I'm okay." "Sort of," he said as he looked over at the cast on his arm. "Does this mean you're going to give me the scooter now?" He laughed. "You went all the way to Hilo and couldn't find one?" "Nope," he said as he pressed the remote control button to adjust the bed to a more comfortable upright position. She stepped to the side of the bed and grasped his good hand. "I'll give you the one I got for Henry and get him something else." "Oh, you don't have to do that. But I appreciate the thought," he said as he reached up to wipe a tear that had rolled down her cheek. She smiled. "I'd hug you, but I'm afraid I'll hurt you." Keith nodded through the pain. "I'll take a rain check." Jasmine squeezed his good hand. "I better get back to the clinic. It won't be long before Kaylani foals, and I want to make sure I'm there when she does. Tell Betty I'll be back as soon as they let me out of this joint. I can still feed all the critters. It just might be a while before I'm a two-handed cow milker." Chapter 11. Sunday evening, Jasmine sat on the couch, stroking Lonnie's head as she thought about what had happened to Keith. It surprised her that over the past couple of weeks, her opinion of him had changed. He wasn't anything like he was in high school. From all indications she had seen since his return to the island, he had matured into a good man. She looked down at Lonnie as she continued to massage behind the dog's ears and said, "What do you think?" Lonnie closed her eyes for a moment in what could be interpreted as sheer bliss, as Jasmine continued to rub. "That's what I thought," Jasmine said as she picked up her cup of cinnamon tea from the end table next to the couch. Maddie was in the kitchen and stood guard over the stove as she pan-fried a couple of fillets of fresh ono in a skillet. "I'm not overcooking it like I did the last time. There's only a minute or two between perfect and overdone. Don't be too hard on yourself. You didn't mean to turn it into jerky the last time, right?" Jasmine teased. "Same to you, quit being so hard on yourself." "What do you mean?" "You've been moping around here all day." "I know, I've been thinking that maybe I've misjudged Keith. And I feel bad about the accident, if I just—" Maddie interrupted, "It wasn't your fault. Get that nonsense out of your head, now grab a plate, dinner is ready." Jasmine shook her head. "You're right. You're a good friend, Maddie, thanks." After dinner, Maddie and Jasmine spent the rest of the evening listening to Christmas music and decorating their tree. They'd been so busy with running the clinic the past week that it was the first chance they'd had to decorate the tree. Besides working all day, Jasmine had been called out the previous 3 nights on emergencies and was exhausted. That night all was well in Waimea town, and she got 8 hours of uninterrupted sleep for the first time in weeks. The next morning she knew the thing she had to do to make things right with her conscience, and looked forward to it. Chapter 12. Keith had been back at work on the ranch for a few days, and was getting along okay with the use of only one arm. He continued to work with Keilani 3 times a day in the arena. Snowy Mauna Kea sat in the background, and he was grateful to still be alive and able to enjoy the view while he worked. While he worked Keilani, he wondered how bad the long-term damage to his hand was and if his rodeo days were over. The doctor had said it was too early to tell for sure. Keith was sad, he wouldn't have a chance to be the bull riding world champion the next year. But he took comfort in the thought that a relationship with Jasmine in the future might be a possibility, something that he'd thought impossible just a few days earlier. After the second workout that morning, he put Keilani in the pasture behind the barn to graze, while he went home to eat lunch and work on his to-do list. He had a list of things around the ranch that he had not gotten to, and one of them was to relocate the chicken coop. Except for the chickens, all the other birds were located in the aviary on the other side of the stable. If he moved the co-op over by the other birds, it would be easier for him to feed them all at once. Jasmine was headed to the stable when she saw Keith come from behind the barn, and she yelled across the parking lot, "I have something for you," as she held up a box wrapped in red and green Christmas paper. She met him across the lot, where he'd parked Bob's old farm truck that he'd borrowed temporarily until he could buy another vehicle to replace the totaled Bronco. She handed him the box and said, "Give this to your niece, it's a scooter. Sam and Jessica had already gotten Henry one, and I didn't know it when I bought this one." Keith smiled, "Wow, that's awesome, thank you. She will be super excited." He paused for a moment and said, "Bob and Nancy are having a Christmas party at Spencer Beach Park this Saturday at 10 a.m., and you're invited." Jasmine stood with her hands on her hips thinking about what he had said for a moment, while kicking rocks in the dirt with her boot before she looked up and said, "Are they inviting me, or are you inviting me?" "I'm inviting you." Jasmine cracked a smile, "Okay, I'll see you there." Then she gave the old farm truck a second look, giggled, and said, "Maybe I should pick you up." He nodded, "That would be great, I'd much rather ride with you than in the back of my brother's truck." Keith put the gift in the back of the old pickup and drove home for lunch. He was so excited when he got there, he almost forgot to put it under the Christmas tree, because all he could think about was Jasmine. Going to the Christmas party together was a miracle, as far as he was concerned. Chapter 13. After lunch, Keith returned to the ranch and had gone to get Keilani to bring her to the arena. When he came around the corner of the barn, he found she had broken into the chicken coop and had her head in a bucket that had been full of chicken feed and was now half empty. Fear jabbed at his gut from the thought of losing Keilani. He'd seen a horse get colic and die from eating chicken feed. For Keilani's sake, he hoped he wasn't too late. He quickly removed her from the coop and walked her toward the stable while he dug into his pocket for his phone to call the clinic. "Maddie, tell Jasmine Keilani got into the chicken feed. I don't know how much she ate for sure, but I think it was about a half a bucket's worth. Hang on, I'll go get her." The clinic was busy, and while he waited for Jasmine he berated himself for not moving the chicken coop sooner. He knew better was the thought that wouldn't leave his mind, no matter how much he tried to force it out. Jasmine came on the phone and said, "Get 2 buckets of ice and put her front hooves into them. It will help prevent laminitis because if she gets it, she could die. You're going to have to stay with her, and let me know if she starts to show signs of colic. Mix some grain and a gallon of mineral oil, and get her to eat it, and I'll be over to look at her as soon as I can. I'd come now, but I have a whole office full of people with sick animals. Find out if the chicken feed is medicated. It makes a difference as to how I'm going to treat her. I'll go check the feed, and if it is, I'll call you back." After she hung up the phone she murmured, "I pray it was just plain feed." 3 hours later, Jasmine had seen all the animals in the clinic and was caught up. She asked Maddie, "Did Keith call?" Maddie shook her head as she closed out the books for the day. Jasmine grabbed her jacket. I'm going to check on Kehlani, I'll see you at home. Jasmine walked across the parking lot to Kehlani's stall, inside the stable. It was late afternoon, and as the sun dropped, so did the temperature. She still wasn't quite used to the weather in Waimea. It was so much cooler than down at the beach where she'd grown up. But she loved the rolling green hills of ranch land that surrounded the town. Kehlani had her front hooves in buckets of ice water just like she'd instructed Keith to do earlier. He had been sitting in a beach chair reading a book, and stood when he saw Jasmine coming toward the stall. "How is she?" Jasmine asked. Keith gave her the thumbs up. "So far so good." Jasmine examined Kehlani for a few minutes and when she finished said, "She needs someone to stay with her 24 hours from the time she ate the feed." Keith nodded. "That would be me. I figured as much. It was on my watch she got into the chicken coop. I'd already planned to stay the night with her." Jasmine kissed Kehlani on the cheek and looked over at Keith. "Call me if she starts showing any symptoms, even if it's in the middle of the night." Jasmine took out a business card and wrote her cell number on the back of it and handed it to Keith. "Or you can call me if you get tired of reading your book later. Remember back in high school, we used to talk for hours on the phone at night." Keith raised an eyebrow. "The main thing I remember, your dad threatened to stick me in a lava tube a piece at a time if I ever tried to have my way with you." Jasmine laughed. "Back then he told anyone I dated that. Your dad wasn't the one I was most afraid of. I viewed your sister Jessica as more dangerous. She made it clear to me way before your father ever had, that I was to be the perfect gentleman, or else she and your sister Pua would use me for a punching bag. She even gave me some side-eye at the parade, for old time's sake." Keith laughed. "She still scares me." Keith smiled and stuck the business card into his shirt pocket, as he sat back down for the long night ahead of him. Chapter 14. It was a cold, rainy morning, and the wind that came off the surrounding mountains had a cold enough bite to it that it reminded Jasmine of wintertime on the mainland. She left early for work, because she needed to make a couple of stops before opening the clinic. Starbucks was first, because nothing in her life happened until she had coffee. Keith had asked her the night before on the phone if she'd bring him a large coffee when she came to see Kehlani in the morning. And not any of that coffee of the day rot gut. Kona or something dark roast would be nice, he said before they hung up. He had called her at around 10 p.m. just to say Kehlani still looked okay, and thanked her for being there when he needed her. They talked about how their lives had gone the last couple of years, and he gave Jasmine periodic reports about Kehlani that came down to no news was good news. It was close to midnight when they finally got off the phone. After Jasmine arrived at the stable, she sat the cardboard coffee cup holder on top of the wooden rail of Kehlani's stall before she opened the door. Keith was still asleep in the chair with a book on his lap. His head leaned back against the wall, and his Stetson pulled down to cover his eyes. Kehlani had her hooves in fresh buckets of icy water, and Jasmine re-examined her and didn't find any signs of laminitis. Keith must have done that not long before she arrived, she thought. She was satisfied Kehlani was most likely out of the woods before she woke Keith. But before she did, she smiled as she watched him sleep for a moment. There was just something about a man wearing Levi's, cowboy boots, and a western shirt that did it for her. It was the Match of Champions belt buckle that had caught her eye. He'd never mentioned to her, on the phone the night before, that he was one of the top-ranking bull riders in the world, or anything else related to the rodeo. They talked about life in general, their favorite TV shows and things they had in common. He was the only man that she knew who would admit he liked Desperate Housewives just as much as she did. Since Kehlani was looking good, Jasmine changed her mind about waking Keith and left him to sleep. She put his coffee next to him on the rail of the stall for when he woke up. Before she left, she took a pen out of her purse and penned a note on the cup. "Come to the office for fresh coffee, Jay." It was about 20 minutes after Jasmine left that Keith's eyes popped open. He'd taken cat naps throughout the night, and had managed to wake up about every 30 minutes to check on Kehlani. After he stretched and rubbed his bloodshot eyes, he looked around the stall and noticed the large cup of coffee on top of the rail that Jasmine had left for him. He reached over and picked it up. The outside of the cup still felt warm. He popped the lid off, slowly took a sip and savored it. 2 more swallows, and he focused his eyes on the side of the cup and saw the note from her. After he gave Kehlani the once-over, he ran his fingers through his hair and stuffed it up under his hat before he headed to the clinic for fresh coffee. Jasmine and Maddie had been looking out the window toward the stable drinking coffee when they saw Keith coming toward them. They could see him, but he couldn't see them because of the mirror film on the window. "What's not to like about that?" Maddie said. Jasmine grasped both hands around her coffee cup and took a sip, after she smiled and lightly nodded. Maddie turned and looked at Jasmine in astonishment. "You like him?" Before Jasmine could reply, the door opened and Keith said, "Morning, ladies." Maddie and Jasmine both smiled, and Jasmine pointed to the coffee pot against the back wall. She broke the momentary silence and said, "I think Kehlani's going to be just fine. I also think you don't need to do the ice buckets anymore today." Keith nodded as he poured hot coffee into his cup. Jasmine and Maddie continued to watch him refill his Starbucks cup. As he stirred in a little cream, he said, "I'll stay with her through the morning until lunch, just to be on the safe side, and then I'm going home to get some sleep. Thanks for the coffee, ladies, much obliged." He tipped his hat on the way to the door. After Keith left the office, Jasmine and Maddie watched him walk back across the parking lot to the stable. "What happened?" Maddie said. Jasmine smiled. "Something good, I think." Before Maddie could ask any more questions, their first customer of the day came through the door carrying what was rumored to be the meanest cat in all of Waimea. He had been to the clinic before, and he had notes attached to his file that said his nickname was Fang for good reason. Chapter 15. When Keith pulled up in front of Grandpa's house, the old man was sitting in a rocking chair on the lanai, sipping a cup of coffee while listening to Bing Crosby on the radio sing Mili Kaliki Maka. It didn't matter whether it was 90 degrees outside or 50, coffee was Grandpa's drink of choice. "There's a fresh pot inside the house, kid," he said as Keith climbed the steps up to the lanai. He took a seat in the rocking chair beside Grandpa and said, "I was going to pass on that, but now that you mention it, passing up the opportunity for a cup of Kona coffee would be a mistake." Keith got up, went inside the house, poured himself a cup, and returned to the lanai. "I just stopped by to see if you needed a hand around here." Grandpa stared at the cast on Keith's arm. "You don't need to give me a hand since you only have one left," he winked. "Your brother told me all about you getting hit up on Saddle Road when he stopped by the other day." Keith glanced down at the cast. "It's just a scratch. The other reason I'm here is I wanted to let you know there's going to be a Christmas party over at the Abernathy Ranch tonight. Actually, it's more like a festival. There will be hayrides and games for the kids. We're going to have a petting zoo, and I'd hoped you would come." "I don't know, Keith. I usually like to watch a little TV after the news and then go to bed." Keith nodded. "That's what Bob said you'd say. I'll be here at 5:30 to pick you up." Grandpa cracked a grin as he slowly rocked. "You were never much good at taking no for an answer when you were growing up. I see you haven't changed much." Keith got up and went inside to put his cup in the sink. On the way out the front door he said, "Thanks for the coffee, I'll see you later," as he smiled all the way back to the truck. After Keith returned to the ranch and fed all the animals, he took Kehlani out for her late morning exercise in the arena. Her belly was huge, and he thought it wouldn't be much longer before she foaled. Jasmine and Maddie closed the clinic at noon, so they could help decorate for the festival. The first thing on their list to do was the hayride wagon. The goal was to make it look like Santa's sleigh. Everyone worked hard to make the ranch look as festive as possible. Keith put jingle bells and bows on the horses that would pull the sleigh. Betty and Willard made signs for the different activity booths inside the barn. Betty had a snow-making machine flown in from Honolulu for the party. All week long on the local radio station, she had advertised a big snowball fight would happen at the festival. Christmas music played while everyone decorated, and it could be heard from the stable all the way to the ranch house at the other end of the parking lot. The purpose of the first annual Christmas festival was to help raise funds for the local food bank. The suggested admission was 2 cans of food or $5. Anyone who wore a Christmas costume was automatically entered into a prize drawing to be held during the festival. Jasmine was in charge of the hot cocoa stand, and Maddie the cookie and cake bake sale. It took them 4 hours of hard work to transform the ranch, but when they were done, it was the closest thing to Santa's village there was in Hawaii. Later that afternoon, when Keith arrived to pick up Grandpa, he was sitting on the lanai drinking coffee just like earlier in the day. The first thing Grandpa said when he saw Keith's costume was, "What are you, one of the 3 wise men?" "As a matter of fact, I am. I forgot to mention there's a costume contest tonight, and the winner gets a free staycation at a private B&B down by the volcano." Grandpa pulled at the whiskers on his beard. "I wish you would have told me earlier," then held up his right hand. "Hang on, I'll be ready in 5 minutes. I've been training for this all year," he said as his hand rubbed his belly in a circular motion. "Have a seat while I get ready." Grandpa came out the front door of the house 5 minutes later, and Keith was shocked to see him wearing a Santa Claus suit. "I already had the belly and the beard. I ordered the suit a while back to wear for the grandkids this year." That evening, Grandpa played Santa Claus at the festival and was the hit of the party. Throughout the night, he rode in the sleigh with the kids and threw candy to the crowd. It was the happiest Keith had seen him since Grandma had passed the year before. Chapter 16. After the Christmas festival, Jasmine invited Keith over for hot cocoa and to watch a Hallmark Christmas movie with her and Maddie. When Jasmine opened the door to the backyard, Lonnie bolted inside the apartment, went straight to Keith and sniffed him thoroughly before giving her seal of approval by licking his hand. Maddie sat on the couch, and in front of her Keith and Jasmine were on a huge beanbag together with Lonnie as they watched the movie. Jasmine was to the left of Keith, and Lonnie was between the two of them, and kept putting her nose under Keith's hand, nudging him to keep petting her every time he stopped. It was just after midnight when the movie ended. Maddie said good night, excused herself and went to her bedroom as Jasmine walked Keith to the front door. While he was putting his coat on, Jasmine said, "Your grandpa was an awesome Santa Claus, make sure to tell him thanks." It was really serendipitous because the Santa Betty had booked, called at the last minute, and said he couldn't make it because of car trouble. "And you driving the sleigh all night, that was great too." "Thank you." Just as they leaned in to kiss, Maddie came out of her bedroom and said, "What time do you?" Surprised, Jasmine backed away from Keith and said 8:30-ish. Keith smiled and stepped out the door backward. Jasmine mouthed, "Next time." As he drove home, his head buzzed with excitement from the near kiss. Even though it was late, he didn't feel sleepy. He thought about Keilani, and decided to stop at the stable and check on her since it was on the way home. As he pulled into the parking lot of the ranch, he saw smoke bellowing from the front of the barn. Keith stopped in the middle of the parking lot and honked the horn 3 times to wake up Betty and Willard. He jumped out of the truck and grabbed a garden hose near the front entrance of the barn. Keith took 2 steps inside, but was forced back outside by a wall of fire that roared toward him. Keith looked over at the ranch house and saw Betty and Willard coming out the front door and yelled, "Call 911, I'll get the horses out of the stable." Afraid the stable was going to catch fire due to its proximity to the barn, Keith ran inside and led the 3 horses out together. He was fortunate that night there were only 3, and not the usual 6 or 7 inside. The rest were all in the pasture. He took the 3 of them, including Keilani, to the arena and closed the gate. By the time the fire department arrived, the barn was fully engulfed. It was a total loss, but the firemen managed to keep the fire from spreading and saved the stable. After the fire was extinguished, Keith put the horses back in their stalls. By then it was 4 o'clock in the morning, and he decided to sleep in the stall next to Keilani. The day before he had set up a cot in that stall, in case he ever needed to spend the night again with her or any of the other horses. Jasmine's plan that morning had been to finish cleaning up after the festival and spend the rest of the day Christmas shopping. She and Maddie left for the clinic, not knowing anything about the fire the night before. They carpooled, and as they rounded the corner of the long driveway into the ranch parking lot, they saw the charred remains of the burned-out barn. She and Maddie got out of the truck and walked over to Betty's house to find out what happened. Keith and Betty were on the lanai talking, and she heard Betty say, "The positive side is we needed a bigger barn. Now we don't have to tear it down, and none of the animals were injured." "What happened?" Jasmine asked. "You tell her, I have to go call the insurance company," Betty said as she went back inside the house. Keith sighed. The fire investigator just left. He said it was likely caused by a short in one of the breakers inside the barn's electrical panel. The only good thing about it was at least all the maintenance equipment had been removed to make room for the festival booths. The bad thing is all of the food donations were lost. Keith saw the sadness in both Maddie and Jasmine's eyes and said, "It's going to be okay. I have an idea of how to replace the food." Almost in unison, Jasmine and Maddie said, "How?" "My grandpa grows taro, and he knows all of the grocery store and restaurant people on this side of the island. I'm going to his house and see if he will ask them all for donations to replace the food lost in the fire." Maddie smiled and Jasmine said, "That's a great idea. Let us know what your grandpa says." Now Maddie and I have to go check on Kaylani. Chapter 17. Even though the barn had burned to the ground, Keith was in a good mood on his way over to Grandpa's house. He was certain Grandpa would ask his contacts at the local restaurants and grocery stores to contribute to the food bank, and they would when asked. Keith parked in front of Grandpa's house and fully expected to see him out on the lanai drinking coffee. That's where he could almost always be found at lunchtime, on any given day of the week. The front door was open and Keith yelled, "Grandpa," as he climbed the stairs to the lanai. He peeked his head inside and rushed in when he saw him lying on the living room floor. A phone was near his hand, and it looked like he'd tried to call for help. Keith checked for a pulse and couldn't find one. He called 911 and put the phone on speaker as he performed CPR chest compressions. It was tricky with the cast on his broken arm, but he managed to keep it up until the paramedics arrived and took over. After arriving at the hospital, Keith called Bob and Nancy. "Grandpa's had a heart attack. The doctor is looking at him right now. A nurse said they'll update us when they know how serious it is." "We're on our way. We just have to drop Emily and Samantha off at the sitters and we'll be there soon," Bob said. Keith texted Jasmine what happened, and that he was at the hospital waiting for Bob and Nancy to show up. He was pacing the floor in the waiting room when Jasmine arrived 10 minutes later. "You didn't need to come," he said as she embraced him. She nodded and looked up into his eyes. "You need everyone right now." 45 minutes later, a nurse came into the waiting area with an update. She huddled in the corner with the Shah Ohana and Jasmine. Keith and Jasmine on one side, Bob and Nancy on the other. "Good news, he's going to be okay. We have some more testing to do, but the doctor says he'll probably be here for the next week." Everyone let out a collective sigh. "Man, that was close," Keith said, and Nancy echoed, "Praise the Lord." Everyone agreed the annual Christmas party at Spencer Beach Park should be canceled. They would spend the next week taking turns visiting Grandpa until the doctor said he could go home. After the third day, Grandpa said, "Come on, Keith, bust me out of this place. Have you had the food here? You'd want to escape too. It'll make your teeth itch, I guarantee it." Keith smiled. "Just one more night or two, Gramps. When I talked to the doctor earlier, he said you'll be able to go home soon." "I hope so. I got to get out of this place so I can get some rest. People have been coming to visit all day long. You're like the 37th one this afternoon. Lock the door on your way out, would you?" Keith smiled. "Okay, Grandpa, I'll see about getting a do not disturb sign for your door. I'd better get going. I have to go check on a pregnant mare at the ranch." Grandpa nodded and said, "You better go check on that Ms. Jasmine too. Don't let that one get away. She's a good woman." He winked. Keith smiled again and nodded. On the way back to the Abernathy Ranch, Keith had a lot to think about. Grandpa would need someone around while he recovered. Keith's hand and wrist needed a minimum year off from the rodeo, and maybe they'd never be strong enough for bull riding again. Life as he knew it was over, and big changes were going to be the new norm. Now Jasmine was all he thought about every day, not bull riding. He'd come to the conclusion this time that he was willing to give up the bull riding world championship to be with her. Every time he pulled into the Abernathy Ranch parking lot and saw her truck, his heart raced. Just the thought of seeing her always lifted his spirit. She'd been busy the last 24 hours with emergencies, and when Keith saw her truck as he pulled into the parking lot, he smiled for a moment. Then it quickly turned into a frown. The one thing that had been dragging him down was the fact he'd failed to come up with an alternate plan to replace the lost food donations, since Grandpa was out of commission and couldn't help. Jasmine was examining Kehlani when Keith walked into the stable. She looked up and saw the sad look on his face and said, "What's wrong, is it your grandpa?" Keith shook his head. "He's fine. I'm just bummed out, I couldn't solve the problem with the food donations." Jasmine smiled. "It's not a problem anymore. It turns out Maddie is some kind of website genius in her spare time. She'd built one for the animal sanctuary, and it has something like 5,000 followers on social media. In the past 24 hours, they have contributed enough money that we can buy twice as much food as what was lost in the fire." Keith's eyes widened. "Really? That's amazing, I didn't see that coming." Jasmine laughed. "I know, me either. Maddie's out grocery shopping right now. Notice the horse trailer is gone? She and Betty took it, so they could fill it with groceries for the food bank. Why didn't you go with them? You guys are like the Three Musketeers," Keith joked. "I wanted to, but I'm pretty sure Kehlani's in the early stage of labor. She's been antsy the whole time I've been here, getting up and laying down. My guess is she's going to foal tonight or early in the morning, and I want to be here when it happens." "Me too. How about I go get us a couple of mixed plates for Christmas Eve dinner?" Jasmine smiled. "That sounds great. I'll have Kalbi ribs, potato mac, and 1 scoop white rice." Keith went to L&L Hawaiian barbecue, and when he returned they went outside the stable, sat on the tailgate of the old farm truck and watched the sunset as they ate dinner and waited for the foal to arrive. Chapter 18. It had been a long night, and Kehlani had given birth just after 4 a.m. The foal was a colt. He was light brown with a dark mane, lower legs and tail. After observing him stand and later nurse in the first 3 hours of his life like he should, Jasmine was satisfied everything was okay and that he and Kehlani were going to be fine. When Keith and Jasmine walked out of the stable, it was like the clouds above had waited for them before dropping a barrage of white icy pellets. The rare hailstorm made it look and feel like Christmas. Keith reached down and scooped up a handful and tossed it at Jasmine, who returned the favor with the accuracy of a sharpshooter. After the impromptu snowball fight, Keith stood next to the farm truck and brushed the hail off and out of his hair, after Jasmine proved she had a much better aim. Jasmine said, "I have to go home and get some sleep." Keith looked at his watch. "That's a good idea, I'm going to do the same. Why don't we meet back here later?" "That sounds good. Jessica is coming over later. She and Sam are taking Henry to play in the snow on Mauna Kea this afternoon. Henry's never seen a newborn foal, so I want to bring them down here later. I'll text you when we're leaving." Keith smiled. "Okay, it's a plan." Jasmine started to turn toward her truck, then stopped abruptly. She spun around and smiled. "Got any mistletoe?" Keith shook his head and said, "I don't need no stinking mistletoe," as he embraced her and planted his lips softly on hers. All Keith saw when he walked into Bob and Nancy's living room was Emily and Samantha shredding Christmas paper. They'd been opening their gifts only a couple of minutes when he arrived. "Look what I got, Uncle Keith," Emily beamed as she pointed at the scooter under the Christmas tree. And Samantha was busy playing with her new doll he'd gotten for her. After seeing the joy on their little faces, he couldn't help but envy his brother's family. Someday he might have one too, he thought, as he sipped a cup of coffee. It was a strange notion for him. He'd never thought about settling down before. It only took 10 minutes for the living room to become unrecognizable with Christmas paper and boxes strewn everywhere. Bob looked at Keith's bloodshot eyes and said, "You need to get some sleep. I'll go pick up Grandpa." "Pick up Grandpa?" Keith's brow furrowed. Yeah, he called last night and said he's getting out today, and asked if we could come get him later. Keith chuckled. Check with his doctor first to make sure he's not pulling your leg. He hates the food, and I wouldn't put it past him if he tried to sneak out while nobody's looking. Bob laughed. Okay, I'll make sure everything is on the up and up with his doctor first. The Shah Ohana was the second to arrive at the stable. Jasmine's was already there. Sam and Jessica stood back while Jasmine brought Henry up close to see the newborn colt, and explained to him that a colt was a boy. What's his name? Henry asked. His Hawaiian name is Kiki Ali'i. In English it means prince, Jasmine said. Henry smiled. I'm going to call him Christmas. Bob and Nancy stood back with Sam and Jessica, as Keith brought Emily and Samantha up next to Henry, so they could see too. The kids watched Kaylani nurse the foal, and Keith put his arm around Jasmine, and together they watched the kids and smiled. As everyone left the stable, Sam said to the group, "You guys should follow us up to the snow." "That's a good idea. I want a rematch," Keith said as he looked over at Jasmine and grinned. 2 hours later, near the summit of Mauna Kea, the big snowball fight took place, and a great time was had by all. The end. Epilogue. A year later, Keith and Jasmine were married on Christmas Day. The ceremony took place at the Second Chance Ranch with snow-covered Mauna Kea and Mauna Loa in the background. Betty and Willard moved to the mainland and sold the ranch to Keith and Jasmine, who had renamed it Second Chance Ranch. Grandpa sold the taro farm and moved into the ohana behind the ranch house. Maddie had fallen in love and was engaged to one of the soldiers who gave Keith first aid up on Saddle Road after his Bronco was crashed into. Keith's left hand and arm recovered, and he was strong enough to ride bulls again if he wanted to. But he had no desire to ever be away from Jasmine again. They went on to have 5 kids, and continued the work Betty had started with the sanctuary. Get the free prequel and new release notifications.